One of the most incredible things that we have seen really in our lifetimes is the complete reduction of American history teaching to rubble. It's been completely flipped. And that is why you see so many young Americans, particularly, who've been indoctrinated into the bizarre belief that America is deeply evil from its foundation, that every aspect of American history is run through with bigotry, racism, homophobia, sexism. And this really comes courtesy, more than any other figure, of the work of Howard Zinn, who is this communist professor, effectively, who promoted a book called People's History of the United States. It became sort of the book that it was cool to read, right? You see it referenced at least twice in what's the name of that film with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck? Good Will Hunting. It's referenced at least twice in Good Will Hunting as a signifier of sophistication. Right? There's one point where Matt Damon, to prove how bright he is, he's secretly bright because he's a janitor, but he's super duper 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 smart. You know he's super duper smart because he says that Howard Zinn will absolutely blow your mind, so we'll know I'm Chomsky. Howard Zinn is one of the most despicable figures in the history of American education. Joining us on the line to discuss is Mary Grabar. She's resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization and the founder of the Dissident Professor Education Project. She's also the author of the great book, Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. Professor Grabar, thanks so much for joining the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's talk about Howard Zinn's book, because many people don't know it and they think that it's esoteric. So how impactful has Howard Zinn's work been? When we read the 1619 Project, isn't it really just sort of a takeoff of Howard Zinn?
Yeah, actually, his chapter on race and slavery begins with an extended quotation from a book by J. Saunders Redding, which is a description of the slave ship. That book was published in 1950 or 1951, and basically the thesis is the same thing, that this country was built on the backs of slaves, other oppressed people, but really the slaves were never freed. The Civil War didn't make any difference, and on, which is basically, Hannah Jones's thesis as well.
So when we look at Howard Zinn's work, I mean, it's become very prominent, millions of copies sold. It's taught as actual curricula in high schools and colleges as well. How pervasive is the influence of Howard Zinn?
Well, it's becoming more and more pervasive. At first, I used to go to these teachers' conferences. I'd sneak in and they'd be talking about how to slip in pages. But since the Obama administration, when the educational guidelines were revised, the AP U.S. history guidelines were revised to the far left, Howard Zinn's book has become the book of choice for those students who are advanced in getting college credit. Over 3 million copies have been sold. It has broken records. It's a crossover book. It's a general interest book, and it's also a textbook. There are downloadable lessons from it at the Zinn Education Project. Other textbooks quote it. There's a young people's history of the United States, which is used in all 8th grade classes in Portland, Oregon. So if you want to know why Portland is so screwed up, look at their 8th grade classes. There are spin-off books. There's a people's history of the Civil War, of art history, of sports, any subject, you name it. You see Howard Zinn's fingerprints all over it.
We're speaking with Professor Mary Grabar. Her book is Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. Now, the perspective of his book, A People's History of the United States, is supposedly this sort of ground up, this is what the people of the time were thinking. But it doesn't seem like, having read the book, it doesn't seem like the book is really all that much about that. It seems much more like the book is about criticizing the traditional view of American history and going particularly after the leadership and suggesting the leadership in the case of the founders were just property revanchists who were seeking to protect their own property interests, which is sort of a story that goes back to falsely proclaimed by Charles Beard, the historian. His story about Abraham Lincoln is that not only was Abraham Lincoln not the great emancipator, but that Abraham Lincoln was in fact attempting to uphold slavery at the beginning of the Civil War. And so it was sort of by accident that slavery was ended. His argument about World War II was effectively the United States integrated all of the fascism of Hitler and took it into its own bones. Now, is what I'm saying here accurate? I mean, what was Howard Zinn's view of the United States?
Well, Howard Zinn's view was the same as Foster, the CPUSA chairman, which is that it's rotten to the core. There can be no reforms. It needs to be overthrown. It's founded on, tenets that are corrupt. It's founded on capitalistic greed, and every effort that is made to reform it, such as abolition, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, those are all futile. The whole system is rotten to the core. It needs to be overthrown. And if you read it and if you look at Howard Zinn's word choice, he's constantly referring to the system and the establishment, those, two favorite words from the 1960s. And he then kind of points off into the distance, this communist utopia that beckons. It's been everywhere it's been tried. The U.S. imperialist forces come in and quash it. And once again, the people are oppressed and suffer. And on it goes. And that's basically the history of the United States, according to him.
We're speaking with Professor Mary Grabar. Her book is Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. So for people who don't know anything about Howard Zinn and his background, who was Howard Zinn? I mean, he sort of proclaimed himself a communist fellow traveler, I suppose, but what was his actual political history?
Well, he actually was a member of the Communist Party. He denied it, and Ron Radish has analyzed his over 400-page FBI file and has concluded that he was, and Ron Radish very briefly was a member himself. Howard Zinn was born in 1922 to Russian Jewish immigrant parents in Brooklyn. So when he was a teenager, it was the 1930s, and it was the heyday of communist recruitment. And he was recruited, and he marched in a communist youth parade. He talks about that. And then he worked in a shipyard, and then he went and served in the war in the Air Force as a bombardier. And when he got out, he went to college on the GI Bill, and that's when he joined the Communist Party. And in 1956, he began teaching at Spelman College, and that's when he dropped his official membership, it looks like, because that's what the orders were for all communists, to infiltrate the institutions. And he taught there until 1963, until he was fired for insubordination by the college's first male and first black president, Albert Manley. He landed on his feet at Boston University, where he gave John Silber, the president, grief until 1988, when he retired. And he led a pretty charmed life. He globetrotted, gave lectures, always at the behest of, communists, and just, really, but he didn't teach. I mean, he radicalized students. That's what he did at both Spelman and at Boston University.
So overall, Professor Mary Grabar, author of Debunking Howard Zinn, how much impact do you think that the Zinn book has had on the American public discourse? And what should Americans really be learning about American history? It's one thing to learn, the evils of American history as a corrective to a sort of whitewashed version of American history, but that's not what Zinn does.
No, actually, when you look at it, he's not really discussing the working class or immigrants. I'm an immigrant myself, and what he says doesn't ring true. I mean, immigrants have seen this country as a land of opportunity and of hope. And the people that are out there protesting, tearing down statues, they have the exact same attitude to the people represented in these monuments that Howard Zinn does. His book is so pervasive; it's hard to quantify. But when you look at what kids are reading in high school, what professors are recommending, how it's entered our culture, as you mentioned, Good Will Hunting. There's also a segment on The Sopranos where AJ, schools his parents on the real meaning of Christopher Columbus. Also, textbooks have taken a cue from Howard Zinn. Someone has noted that since his book came out, most U.S. history textbooks now start with Christopher Columbus. And they take a similarly jaundiced view of Christopher Columbus as this genocidal, capitalistic maniac out there hacking off the hands of the indigenous people for their gold. And so you've got this setup. These are the origins of this country right from the get-go, from the man who discovered it is corrupt. And there are also textbooks that quote Howard Zinn extensively and say that he was a legitimate historian. And these are textbooks for middle school students.
Well, Professor Mary Grabar, I really appreciate your time. Go get a copy of her book, Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. It's a really good piece of work and a really important one. Professor Grabar, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.